Now, if I was to tell you that there was another class of corvettes produced alongside the Flag class corvettes by part of the British Empire, and despite there being far less of those built, there are actually more survivors of that class, you'd probably be shocked. But that is what I'm exactly about to tell you today.
Hello and welcome to, well, the boiler room on HMAS Castlemaine. Now this is a very, very cool space. And it's somewhere which I'm quite happy to be in because it is such a cool space and it is so viable for me to be able to wandering around. Also, the sheer amount of work they've done here. Look. You can see inside the boiler. You can see inside the boiler. I'll be getting zoomed in with that in a bit. We've got 2 boilers. Full boilers. Got full evacuation systems. And all the various pipes for controlling the steam. As you can see, pumps oil from the heating tank to the furnace. Port fuel tank capable of taking 14.3 tons, that's 1,480 litres. Number 4, and there's the seawater level. Seawater level is here. It's over my head. I'm below seawater level. You know roughly me, I'm roughly 6 foot. So I'm not at the bottom of the vessel by any means, but I am close to, and I'm already below head height below water.
Now, I honestly wasn't sure where to use that video. I really wasn't. It was quite an interesting one to put in there somewhere, but it didn't really feel like a middle of the presentation video. So I put it at the beginning, and I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you enjoyed what was the very first video I took aboard HMAS Castlemaine. And before we get into too much discussion about HMAS Castlemaine and the Bathurst class, I think it's worthwhile bringing up some books. This is produced by HMAS Castlemaine's group themselves. This is The Corvette That Came Home by Kerry Hodders. It's a really, really good book, and it's, all these books have informed today's discussion. The ABC of Royal Australian Navy Corvettes. Again, rather appropriate. There is a Bathurst class on the front. Looking rather fetching and rather cool. And this one is the Royal Australian Navy's produced, Capable Beyond Our Dreams, Australia's Bathurst class corvettes, 1940-1960, by John Henshaw. Again, a really good book. And I'm very lucky to have these to help me with my work and help me with my production of today's video. Now, the thing about a Bathurst class is they are really kind of cool. They're basically why the Royal Australian Navy didn't go Flag class, but they also serve with the Royal Indian Navy, and some of them are actually paid for by the British Admiralty. And there's all sorts of stories about them, but pretty much this class is entirely domestically produced by the Australians. They are designed by the Australians, they are built by the Australians, they're built using Australian machinery, Australian engineering, Australian shipyards. Some of their armaments and some of the things that do come from Britain, do come from other parts of the Commonwealth and the Empire, but yeah, they are Australian built. And they're a really interesting story because in many ways they're a high point of Australian industry. And that's something weird to say when we're talking about the 1940s, the late 1930s, and we're in the 2020s. But in terms of shipbuilding capacity, this was when Australia arguably had the most yards, the most versatile of yards it ever had, and the widest range of yards it ever had. Today's modern Australian shipbuilding industry is reflective of decades of neglect and decades of inattention, and a government which really does believe in a stop-start approach to procurement. And please note, I say this coming from Britain, which also typifies this, and many other nations in the world which typify this scenario. frankly, the Americans are only being saved by the sheer volume of production they are producing. The sheer volume is what saved them, not saved their industrial capacity as it is. Not better politicians. Not better leadership. Because I would say the thing is, these vessels, the Bathurst class, are produced in a period where it's understood what happens if maritime trade, if the world stops moving, if maritime trade falls. It hasn't happened in such a long time. Yes, we've had hiccups with the Suez Canal and various other things, but we haven't really had a global stoppage. Not for months on end. And that's the difference. These ships, this security, this value, this capability is produced in a time when companies not only understand the threats they're facing, but are actively facing that threat. When countries understand the threat they're facing and are actively facing that threat, because the threat is palpable. And it has been palpable, and they've had recent experience of what happens when it goes wrong. And this is the important thing. They know what happens when it goes wrong. And as such, they are preparing. They are preparing for the worst. And these ships, with their form, with their functionality, with their capability, with their spread of abilities, are not massive warships to win mighty battles, but they are about waging a war. Now, they are ordered by the Australian Commonwealth Navy Board. It's interesting because the board are making very similar moves, and this is one of the things I looked into when I looked at this point under the first naval member and chief of staff, Admiral Ragnar Colvin, in 1937-38, as are being made back in the UK. And Ragnar is an interesting gentleman. He is a high-flying naval officer in the Royal Navy who's gone up and is now the person in charge of the Royal Australian Navy. Now, interestingly enough, he has a friend back in the UK. And I managed to work this out by going, hang on, they're making similar positions, and they've served in very similar places, and they were even probably to an extent at Admiralty at the college together when they were training officers. That's Admiral Henderson, who's the third Sea Lord. Now, Henderson is pushing for the Royal Navy to build Flower-class corvettes. He's putting through the design standards and procedures there. And the corvettes, of course, Flower-class, were originally being procured as much to be minesweepers as they were anti-submarine warfare vessels. They basically were building sloops, but they're going to be built to full merchant standard, so we can build them as quickly as possible. And this works. This works really, really well. Well, the thing is, so is Ragnar Colvin, pushing the same thing. He's pushing for one to be able to produce domestically in Australia. And you find the odd one out is Canada in this scenario, but Canada's often the odd one out in these scenarios because, well, Canada has issues getting their politicians to pay for infrastructure, even at this period. They get to it rather earlier than some other nations. And basically, what they've done, and you've seen the design, is they go, what can we produce domestically? What can we produce in enough numbers domestically using the facilities, using the industry we have available? Because we have lots of yards which are very experienced at building merchant ships. So let's look at what a merchant-style hull would be. Let's look at what this design could be. Now, there's also the work of Captain Collins and others to consider, because there were lots of people who were putting forward these papers, who were putting forward these ideas. And you have to remember, often, a lot of the senior admirals, the way they work is they would find a captain or a commander who agreed with their form of thinking, but who had far more time on their hands to write a long paper, to write the position paper. And they would provide a coverage for them to do so. They would assign them to do it, and they'd have them go write it. One of the interesting things about the papers put forward is they tend to focus again on smaller vessels, like the Kingfisher class, which could theoretically be produced in larger numbers. But the Kingfisher class were not as useful when it came to ASDIC, were not as useful when it came to putting in the systems and sensors you need to put. You needed something bigger than that. And this is where the Flower class, the Bathurst class really get their, not just their ceiling, but their basement. They have a ceiling beyond which, if you build them bigger than this, you're not going to produce them in enough numbers. But they also have a basement below which, if you build them below this, they're not going to be able to do the job you're going to require them to do. And that's really where this class comes. This class fits well in that. And that's what the Australian Commonwealth Navy Board was looking for. Now, again, you won't find many designs linking between the Flower class and the Bathurst class. You find they go through a similar design process of evaluating existing sloop classes. Just as the Royal Navy had been building the sloop classes in the interwar period to test out the designs of what small ships they needed and what they needed to do with them, the Australian Commonwealth Naval Board was evaluating those, and especially I would say Colvin and Collins and a few others, were evaluating those in light of Australian understanding, Australian needs. And they recognise there is a differential between Australian needs and British needs. It's not a massive differential. There is a reason, after all, the Royal Navy are quite happy to order several of the Bathurst class, and are quite happy to order for local work, and also order some for the Royal Indian Navy. There is also a reason why the Australians order quite a lot of British-built vessels. There are similarities. They are both dependent on maritime trade. They're both dependent on these goods getting through. But there are enough differences, especially in what they can support domestically. And that's the critical thing. The ACNB wanted a design they could support and build domestically. And so they end up with this class, with this capability, which is a good one. They are a good capability. And they also end up with rather a lot of them. Now, this is literally half of them, pretty much. There's actually, I divide them up by dockyard because I wanted to be able to illustrate how many each dockyard produced. And as you can see, you've got BHP produce 4 of them, Waialia included, which is their first one they produce, and she is now still surviving. She's been preserved in Waialia, basically by the company which built her. Technically, it's local government, etc., which own her, but pretty much the company that built her, the company which built her to defend their trade in many ways, managed to see her preserved. Then you've got the Navy. Well, between Cockatoo Island and Her Majesty's Naval Dockyard, they managed to produce 15, which is good going. It's good going. Apart from the fact there's going to be another civilian yard, which will on the second set, which produces 15 as well. So they produce a quarter of the 60. A quarter of the 60. And what's interesting here is the sheer number of yards involved and the number of vessels they're producing. It's a real business. It's a real procedure, and this is something we're going to be talking about as we go on, because, as I said at the beginning, this is the high point, a high point of, in many ways, Australian industry and Australian self-sufficiency. And it's a really sad thing it's gone and it's over, because it was a great period. It was a great period for Australia. Now, no video of mine will be complete without a Shameless book plug. I put them in every video because I'm an academic, believe it or not. If the fact that I named this originally Dr. Alex Clarke because of, well, helping my students find it, and then I've kept it because, honestly, the most famous Alex Clarks on YouTube have nothing to do with naval history, and I have no desire to get into competition in logography with them, so I'm going to keep the Doctor because it differentiates me from them. Seriously, type in Alex Clarke into YouTube, see what comes up. Then type in Dr. Alex Clarke, see what comes up. It's a very easy way to make myself stick out a bit. And as such, books, publishing, that's how we are rated, that's how we're reviewed. So getting another book out in next year is going to be really cool. That's going to be a self-published primer. It's all thanks to you and your support during Historiathon. Getting another of the book out like this at some point soon, another bigger book, maybe. I've done some submissions to publishers, and I've done some submissions to journals, and some submissions to conferences, so we'll see what happens next year. It could be fun, it could be interesting. I won't be moving house next year. In fact, I've basically said now that we've moved house, my plan is not to move from this house again. I've got a big enough space. I should not need to. I should not need to. You know, maybe my life works out very differently and I don't end up alone, but you don't know. But as far as I in my understanding of the world as it is now, I shouldn't need to. So, I I never have to go through that again. So I can concentrate on other, more fun things. Conferences. Writing papers, writing books, giving YouTube videos, going on trips with the shipshape crew. That is a good thing. That is a lot of fun. And that's all thanks to you, so thank you. And this is the Christmas videos we've got coming up. Now, to historians, there should already, because this is coming out on Monday. This is coming out on Monday the 9th. And it was supposed to be coming out Monday the 2nd. It didn't come out Monday the 2nd because there were all sorts of issues with the original recording. In that, well, the original recordings, I didn't like how some of them flowed into the voiceover bits. I didn't like how some of them just dealt with the building work that had been going on around. And basically, this has been re-recorded at night. In the middle of the nights, I have been re-recording this. So I've doing DIY and doing this. Just to make it fit. And there are more of these coming up because we've got Diamantina on the 16th. And Vampire on the 30th. And they're really cool. I'm looking forward to doing those. I've got Onslow on the 13th. And then we have some of the ships from the Scandinavian trip are also included. Have also been added into this series. And they're going to be discussed. They're going to be coming up. Because I like the idea of doing more. I like the idea of putting them all in. The Scandinavia trip ones aren't listed on this, but that's because they're mostly coming after this point. They're mostly going to be coming out. I'm going to try and keep them coming out on every other Monday for a little while. And I'm possibly going to try and keep some two historians coming out on every other Monday for a while. Because I think the historians coming out on a Monday is kind of a fun thing if I can do it. Maybe I'm going to make them Wednesdays. I'm still deciding on that one. It might be Wednesdays, it might be Wednesdays or Monday videos. Monday is not always the best day of the week for me to put out a video. For some reason, people don't watch Monday videos on Mondays. But leave that to one side. The stuff we got coming up, which is really going to be interesting and really going to be fun. Well, we've got F3, the whole alternate history based on what happens if the F3 design is selected for the Royal Navy instead of the O3 design for the Nelrods. The Royal Navy goes with a fast battleship design, realistically. The F3 was a fast battleship of its period. And it could have been a 28-knot ship. It could have been side left. There's a whole debate going on, which I'm going to get into, of whether they were 2-shaft designs or 3-shaft designs or what they were. My strong that they seem to be always listed as 2-shaft designs. But I think for the faster versions, which they were looking at with the F2s especially, they would have had to be multi-shaft designs to be able to get that much power into the water. They'd have had to have more than 2 shafts. So the Royal Navy, that probably means they'd have had 4 shafts. The Royal Navy doesn't tend to like 3-shaft designs when they go for it for the Illustrious class. It's literally because the choice is put in a 4th shaft or put in the necessary subdivision that they want to do for the torpedo defences. And they decide to go with the torpedo defences. And there's a reason the Illustrious class are famed for. You can hit them, you can whack them, you can bash them, you can crush them, you can do whatever you like to them. And they still keep going, we're still floating. Part of it was that. And also, part of the problems they had for their life was if they have problems with their engines, the free shaft design is not necessarily the most stable or easy to manage. Life's fun. But yeah, there's some good key ships, good key aircraft videos coming up. I'm going to be asking this question a lot, I think. Do we think the key aircraft video for the Friday the 20th of December should be Santa's sleigh, or should it be something else? Make suggestions. Let's see what we come up with for a Christmas phone. But yes, the first point to making these ships Australian, getting into this, is the engineering. Now, what do we mean by this stuff is being produced locally? Well, Castlemaine is the example I'm using in this because she's the survivor. You can go see her. And the dockyard that she's built in, her or His Majesty's Australia dockyard in Williamstown, Victoria. It's a suburb of Melbourne, by the way, if you want to know that and want to look it up quite quickly. It's 90 minutes drive 90 minutes drive. 140-ish kilometres from Castlemaine, Australia, where Thompson's had a big foundry that built things like ship engines and plant. There's stuff that comes from Ballarat, there's stuff that comes from all over this area and feeds into the dockyard. This stuff is built locally. This plant, this ship, this engineering, all the the boilers, the engines, all these things come from local producers. And that's important. Australia doesn't really have the capacity to build something which is a cruiser or a carrier itself at this point, but they can build corvettes and they are cranking them out. And the Bathurst class are all theirs. All theirs. And that's the important thing, and this is the other real hole in the whole idea of, oh, they are derivative, they are something like this design, etc. No. Concept, yes. Concept, I would argue, is a pooled concept across the Royal Navies. It's a pooled concept. And I've talked about how I feel it was pooled and the sort of network that I feel was propagating it. But in terms of substance, in terms of design, it's a local one. It has to be. Because it's using local machinery built to local standards. And yes, those standards are to an extent the same as the British ones because they are in a part of the empire, but they're also different. And the capabilities of the yards are different. There is a reason why the boilers which go into the Bathurst class are higher pressure boilers and a more of a naval type boiler than the civilian boilers which go into the Flowers. What's the reason? Guess what boilers they can build in Australia? So they have more powerful boilers. But they're using triple expansion engines or multiple expansion engines. And the really cool thing is I could talk to you about a multiple expansion engine, but I'm going to let you look at one as it turns over. And this is a really special treat they did for me in Castlemaine when I was in it, and something which I will be eternally lucky for. Turns out, I think it's a former head of the program there, former director or whatever. He really wanted to get the engines working, and he was a retired engineer. So he knew he couldn't get them really working, but the man had a plan, and it's a good one.
So that shows you how it works. So your steam comes in that big white pipe.
Yeah.
Hits the first piston, pushes up down. This locks and releases, or releases and locks the steam in the second piston, pushes up down, that does the same stuff for the crankcase, direct drive, the propeller.
Yeah.
And that's your accelerator. Accelerator body.
Yeah.
So you control it by steam pressure. As you can see, 2 chambers, top pressure. Although a good engineer could push it past 250 if you wanted to.
Is that open down there, or is that a special?
Yeah, mate, come down.
How high? It's
These engines were actually cast in Castle.
I have to say, one of the things I love about that clip, and there's a reason I left the sound on, I didn't do a voiceover, is that you hear the real pride in the volunteer's voice that these engines were cast in Castlemaine. They are local. They are local engines. And also, there's the stuff of how many times do you hear me telling, well, good engineers can push these things when it comes to pressure. You hear someone else going, well, yeah, if this is the accelerator, this wheel is how we control the pressure going into the engines, and a good engineer listening can push it. And that's the point. A good engineer, by listening, by watching their boiler, by knowing their engines, by listening to that steam, can push it. And that's the other reason they're building up the kit they are, because they have lots of engineers who are used to this kit. How do you mobilize quickly? How do you get those personnel, key personnel like engineers, into your ships? Well, what you need are experienced personnel who know that equipment. So it's better to use the equipment they're used to. This is another problem which comes up with rapid mobilization of force, and one of the reasons why technology in wartime doesn't necessarily take the great leaps you might think it will do. Because if you're also mobilizing en masse and you don't want to spend years retraining people before you can have those people in service, it's better to have the equipment in service that is the stuff they are used to using, or at least have an understanding of. It's not too far removed from what they've got experience on. Which might also explain the approach to drones currently going on in certain scenarios. Because, again, if you can use stuff which you're used to using, it might not be as good as the stuff you could be given, but something you can get the most out of usually works better than something that you don't have the foggiest about how to operate and are nervous about using. And this leads us to the construction, which is a nice area to talk about. And here we have a vessel being launched, HMAS de Lorraine at Mort's Docks. And there's a whole story behind Mort's Dock. Now, she was being launched by Dame Mary Hughes, who's the wife of the Minister of the Navy. And she commissions into the Royal Australian Navy on 22nd November 1941. But the interesting thing is where she's built. She's built at Mort's Dock. Now, Mort's Dock is in New South Wales, in Balmain, and it was a very productive area, a very useful area for Australian industry. It was the site of Sydney's original dry dock, and it had been lengthened to 640 feet in 1898, that particular dry dock, but it also had slipways. It was a key engineering facility. It didn't normally launch ships, and didn't normally build ships, but in wartime it was a perfect site to use. The fact that this place has now been pretty much completely paved over by the Department of Housing in modern days, just a symptom of it, really. It was functionally critical infrastructure in its time period, and using this way shows the advantage of the infrastructure and not how it could be spread about. But in the case of de Lorraine, well, her operational history is pretty darn cool, as said. After commissioning, she goes into escort anti-submarine patrol vessel role, and specifically, after only commissioning in November 1941, in 1942, in January 1942, so only a couple of months into her life service, well, she was operating not far from Australia, and the US were escorting a tanker through, and there was also de Lorraine around the area. And, well, the I-124 decided it was going to sink the de Lorraine. And, unfortunately, their torpedo missed, and de Lorraine located them with her ASDEC. And this just made it worse. This just made it worse for the Japanese submarine. And not only had they failed to hit this vessel, which frankly should have been a one-shot, one-kill, if actually hit by the torpedo, well, de Lorraine comes in for depth charge attacks. It does two. The I-124 is forced to the surface. And then she observes large bubbles of oil and air. At this point, I-124 realises that there's not only de Lorraine there, there's also Cantuba and Lithgow. So there's 3 Bathurst class sitting there. And basically, they just keep patrolling and depth charging the area while de Lorraine is reloading. And they're alternating it. And eventually, USS Edistal also gets involved. After all, they were escorting an oil tanker, the USS Trinity, which was an important vessel. And the 4 vessels share the credit of killing I-124. That's what was decided in the end. That is the first enemy submarine sunk in Australian waters. And it was sunk by a lovely, how do I put this, Clemson-class destroyer, which is modified for ASW work, and 3 Bathurst-class corvettes. And of those, I'd say probably the Bathursts were the better vessels for the ASW job. But the Edsel cannot be forgotten. Launched from an engineering area. That's it. One of the interesting things about Mort's Dock, an engineering company, is that it's in many ways as much a cooperative as it is a company. It does seem to have multiple companies in it. One of the things I also love is that so many different companies are involved in this, and so many different projects are involved, organisations are involved in putting the Bathurst class together, and yet they come out remarkably homogeneous in terms of their operation. Some of these companies are involved in this construction for the first and only time in their entire histories. And yet what comes out works. It's a testament. Well, it's testimony to the skill of the engineers and the constructors involved and the workmen involved, but also it's a testament to the quality of the design that was able to be so easily translated and able to be so fundamentally built within the scenarios it found itself. Again, they followed a theme, and the theme was, we're going to fit with some 20mm Oricons. Eventually they have them, and they have some Bofors installed later on. The 4-inch and 12-pounder, some of them were fitted with originally, then some of them got upgraded to a 4-inch. They all had a certain level of general purpose capability. But realistically, the air defense weaponry was always about having something to deter aircraft from snooping too closely. These were not the ships which were going to be attached to major fleets going into battle and carry battle groups. They were not for that. They were for convoy escorts, preferably of convoys routed as far away from enemy aircraft as you physically could. Think about it more as the Mid-Atlantic Gap, or the Indian Ocean, places where, yes, you can get air attacks, yes, the enemy can show up, but it's going to be rare. Again, it's the Southern Pacific. It's routing yourself away from the Japanese defences. And yes, some of them do go up threat, but that's not technically what they're built for. But saying that, they are built with a range of positions and sensors and abilities to have things like HUFDUF, high-frequency detector systems, and radars, and, of course, enhancements for the Mark I eyeball installed. And they have them. Now, these components are often the most interesting to see how they're installed, because they weren't really sure when they'd arrive, they weren't really sure how many quantities they get, they weren't really sure what they get, considering when they're ordering them, but they know they're going to get something, and the British are going to try and send them something, or eventually they're trying to buy American kit as well. And the point is, they install the facilities needed to support them. They install the power generation capabilities. The things, there is space and there is weight allocated in the design. And that's useful. That is useful. It's also worth noting that most of their systems are general-purpose weaponry. There's a reason for that again. These vessels could find themselves dealing with a torpedo boat attack. They could find themselves dealing with a submarine on the surface. They could find themselves dealing with scout aircraft. They could find themselves dealing with a range of issues, including a surface radar, of course. And they needed to have the range of capabilities to deal with the likely threats they're going to face in, I would say, secondary theatres and the like. That's what they're built around. That's what they're purposed around. And they're capable of that. It's not just submarines they attack, it's whatever gets in their way. What's furthermore interesting about the Bathurst class is quite often they seem to be fitted with Australian-built variants, rather than necessarily getting British radar when it came available, or even American radar when it came available. The Australians were very much trying to go their own way, and going their own way as successfully as they could. Sometimes they did, sometimes they did get, British versions, but also some of the best radar sets available in the world at the end of the war were the Australian-built radar sets. The Australian versions, because they often had improvements function into them. Things which made sense when you're building six or eight of them, versus when you're trying to build 600 of them. You can afford for there to be slightly more complications when it's a slightly more cottage industry. And that shouldn't be taken as a demeaning thing. It would actually be nonsensical for Australia if they weren't producing them by the 100, as opposed to Britain and America, if they didn't include those advantages. Yes, it slows down their production, but there again, they're not producing as many. And their rate of production of ships and rate of fitting ships reflects that. But also their rate of need. It's like the 4-inch gun versus the 12-pounder. In terms of its air defense capabilities, you find usually the vessels operating on the northern coast and the northern areas of Australia and doing convoy duties there either are equipped with it early on or initially, or are quickly re-equipped with it as soon as it becomes available, because the 4-inch is considered better at the AA roll than the 12-pounder. But a 12-pounder is perfectly fine. Now, you can build the ships. That's perfectly normal. You can put the ships up, but commanding them, crewing them, that is a different matter. Where are you getting those people from? This is where HMAS Castlemaine really becomes very useful, because when you look at her, she has listed 6 different command points. Okay. 5 officers fill those 6 different points. One who's a temporary commander at one point becomes her final commander as well. So he's both number 4 and number 6. Of the 5 officers involved, 3 are Royal Australian Naval Reserve S, in brackets, and I'll explain that in a second. One is Royal Australian Navy Volunteer Reserve, VR, and one's Royal Australian Navy. Now you're probably sitting and going, Alex, why did you emphasise the S? Well, Royal Australian Navy Reserve, S standing for seagoing, and they often put the S in brackets for seagoing, means most of the time, and when I say most of the time, there are some interesting exceptions who were in there for specialist reasons, that you were a merchant sailor, a merchant officer of some rank. And so, if we consider her first commanding officer, Philip Jack Sullivan, who will command HMAS Castlemaine from the 30th of April 1942 to 23rd of June 1944, and who is a lieutenant commander in this force. He joined the Royal Australian Naval Reserve, as with the brackets of S, in 1932. In 1940, he's promoted to lieutenant commander from lieutenant. And in 1947, he's promoted to full commander. And again, please note, there are, technically before his rank is usually a T for temporary or various other things before it. It can be translated as, but yeah, that's it. And Jack Sullivan is pretty much her commander, as I said, for most of her wartime service. He literally commands her from April 1942 to June 1944. The others who come in, and I'm going to make sure I get their names right, because I've tried doing this from memory, and I keep getting Basil and Gilbert the wrong way around, actually, let's be honest, and I'm going to read it from the book. Then, and that's taken over. Technically, according to Allied warship commanders, Sullivan is in charge till June 1944. According to the book, he's only in charge till March 1944. Then Lieutenant Commander Basil Paul, who's also Royal Australian Naval Reserve S, takes over in March 1944 till June 1944. He is, of course, his second commander, and he was born in London in September 1904. So he's a 40-year-old gentleman, and, well, nearly a veteran. Lieutenant Commander Philip Sullivan had been born in August 1897 and would die in October 1987. So, yeah. 90 years, and at this point, well, when he achieves command, he's 45. When he leaves command, he's nearly enough 47. Then it's Lieutenant Gilbert Gordon of the Royal Australian Navy, between June 1944 and November 1944. Then it's Lieutenant Francis B. Moss, Royal Australian Naval Volunteer Reserve, with an S next to it. Again, it's a seagoing again. He was born in 1907, so he's the youngest so far. And he's acting commander. He literally does the 4th of November to the 13th of November when Lieutenant Commander P.G. Collins, Royal Australian Naval Reserve, that's R, not VR, S, takes command. And he'll be in command till the 18th of May 1945. He was born in 1901. So actually he was a little older than Basil, but younger than Sullivan. Also, possibly not as healthy as Sullivan, considering he dies in 1978, and Sullivan, who is his older, lives till 1987. So Sullivan was really a healthy gent, it seems. And then Lieutenant Francis B. Moss takes over. Takes over and does 18th May 1945 to December 1945. So where is the Royal Australian Navy actually getting these officers? They're getting experienced merchant sailors. Experienced merchant sailors who know how to run a ship. Their view is this: they can teach you to fight, especially the circumstances you're going to find yourself fighting this. And you're not talking about massive tactical battles. You're talking about anti-submarine operations, where they can give you step-by-step guides for processes of how to do, because conducting an ASW operation is kind of like besieging a star fort. If you follow certain methodologies, you might not win, but you won't lose. If you follow those methodologies properly. They can teach you how to use the guns, and you might well know a little bit, because after all, quite a lot of merchant sailors had served in World War One as well, so they had some experience, even as juniors. Again, if we consider Jack Sullivan, well, born in 1897, 17 at the beginning of World War One. Yes, he was born in Sydney, New South Wales. Yes, he was as Australian as they come, but he would not have escaped World War One service. Not even by virtue of being Australian. He would have found some time. And this is what you have. A lot of the senior officers are reservists. They are experienced merchant sailors. Yes, there's often a levelling of junior officers who are wartime service only commissions or short-term commissions. But the senior officers for a lot of these vessels tend to not be regular Navy. They tend to be the reserves. Either the Volunteer Reserve, which is also known sometimes as the Yacht Reserve, basically the yachties, and then the Royal Australian Naval Reserve, which is usually made up of the merchant sailors. It's one of those interesting things that the Royal Australian Navy basically adopts the same system the Royal Navy has back in the UK, where you have the VR, which are mostly the yachting fraternity, and to an extent some of them are yacht clubs. But I don't want you to think badly of them for saying that. No, they turn out to be very skilled and very courageous officers in World War II. They do a lot of very good work, and frankly, for the Royal Navy, it was probably the best investment they could do to get the officers they needed to surge out for small boat operations, for torpedo boats and for corvettes, etc., to have enough officers with enough experience. And for those vessels, what you needed was either young officers who were used to inshore waters, or older officers who had experience of operating at sea. And some of the yachtsmen who were involved were people who liked to sail across the Atlantic for fun. Those were men who really did know their skill set. And a fair number of women tried to join as well, because they were experienced yacht ladies as well at that time. Even then, they usually were shown to the WRNS, and you will find they turn up in some interesting places. They really do. Again, when the Royal Navy's looking for some senior officers for the Wrens, there are some very, very capable people found. But the Royal Navy Reserve, the RNR, well, that was always more of a thing for ex-regulars and merchant sailors. That was more of a, we're going to have this group, we're going to try and attract these people into this. And often the difference between those two groups is not that great, because quite often you come out of the Navy, what career have you been trained for? Well, you could be a machinist in a factory, all sorts of things. You might become a publican. You might well become a merchant sailor. Especially if you're of a certain rank of officer, you come out. The merchant Navy life might be the life for you to, continue with following your passion and love for the sea. And it's personnel like that who are called back and who are suddenly, when you're looking at the armed merchant cruisers in World War II, and people going, well, hang on, where's this captain come from? Well, he was a captain, which was an officer who was probably cut under the Guides Axe in the 1920s. And he's gone to merchant marine. He's been a master mariner. He's been a captain. He's done all sorts of things in there. And now we have an armed merchant cruiser. Yeah. You'll do. You'll do. We're growing a navy. We need the people who are current to try and service the new aircraft carriers, the new cruisers, the new destroyers, lead all those. For an armed merchant cruiser, what do we need? We need a good quality officer who's used to a merchant ship and can get the best out of a merchant ship. Who's going to be better at that? A naval officer who spent the last decade or so in merchant ships, or a naval officer who's used to it being fully naval? And this is the point for these vessels. They're going to spend most of their time operating with merchant ships, doing similar characteristics and similar requirements. Sullivan is very, very good, and some of the operations he gets involved in as the senior officer, and that's always the interesting thing. If you look up in terms of Castlemaine's career, if you just want a quick look up of her career, you go to her website or you go to the other source about her, you'll find that she's often on operations acting as the senior ship because her CO is the senior officer because of the date of his commission and his experience. And most of that's the case during which Sullivan is in charge. And he does a good job. He really does. On the first, I would say, critical operation she's involved in, that's November 1942, where she can really have a major issue and cause major things. She's taking part in the evacuation of some troops, and it's all being organised by Pope, who's the Commodore in charge at Darwin, and Sullivan is the commanding officer aboard Castlemaine, which is the commanding ship for the operation. They're taking Kuru, which is a patrol boat / transport, and her sister, the Armadale, with them, and their plan is to go to a place, pick up the troops, drop off supplies, and then get the personnel ashore. Well, get the personnel back to Australia. They run into problems. They have to make perfectly logical decisions of splitting up the force. And unfortunately, well, Armadale didn't make it back. Castlemaine did. Castlemaine made it back. But Castlemaine, you know, made it back because she's the last survivor that's in the water. Warrnambool is ashore. She doesn't count the same. But before we get on that, we should probably look into HMAS Freemantle and her career. Now, when I want to look at one of these ship service records, I of course have this as an option, the Royal Australian Navy Corvettes, which has some really cool photos and small explanations of what Freemantle got up to and what her career was like and what she was doing. And points out, of course, that she is fitted with an A272 radar set, which stands for Australian Type 272. As I understand it, there have been a whole maelstrom of different letters because they keep changing their minds about letters at various points to do with radar throughout World War II, just to give historians who are mildly dyslexic the absolute nightmare every time and checking things 3, 4, or 5 times over, and hoping that the person whose sources were reading has not had a similar issue and has not made a mistake, because otherwise that'd be really confusing. But the better write-up is probably in this one. April 1943. On completion of her trials, Freemantle was assigned duty as an escort vessel on the east coast of Australia. At this period, Japanese submarines were active in Australian waters, and a month preceding Fremantle's first operational duty, 7 ships had been sunk in coastal areas. August 1943 proceeded to Darwin, where she was based as an escort vessel, operating mainly between Darwin and Thursday Island until April 1945. During this period, on 21 months in northern waters, the tide of war was steadily receding from Australia theatre, and her duties were confined mainly to routine, uneventful merchant ship protection. But you can just guarantee if they hadn't been doing it, these merchant ship journeys would have been anything but uneventful. June 1945 arrived at Manus to begin a new period of escort duty and guard ship duty in the New Guinea area, which occupied the ship until the end of hostilities. 31st August 1945, arrived at Hong Kong, and while based there as a unit of the 21st Minesweeping Flotilla, took part in a series of clearing sweeps in Chinese waters. 25th January 1946, paid off into reserve at Melbourne. 10th of December 1952, recommissioned at Melbourne. 8th March 1953, reached Fremantle and commenced service as a training ship for the Western Australia area. In this role, until the scheme was abandoned, Fremantle introduced large numbers of National Service trainees to naval life afloat. In addition to her training duties, Fremantle also acted at times as a fisheries protection vessel with the Japanese pearling fleet in the area of Funa Sea, and on a survey and general fleet duties in the Western Australia area. 22nd of June 1959, finally paid off in Sydney for disposal. She'd steamed 113,654 miles since recommissioning in 1952. In all, including her wartime service, she had steamed 190,776 miles. 6th of January 1961, sold to Kinoshita, Australia, Party Limited, to be broken up. Battle Honours, Pacific 1941-45, Darwin 1942-3. Probably when I said I was talking about her service, going to talk about her service record, you thought I was going to say that Fremantle did some startling things. She took part in commando operations, or she was this wonderful ship which went from battle to battle to battle. But no, she wasn't. In fact, it's the reverse. She spends her war doing service, being necessary, being needed, but not being what we would think of as a warship. For most of the war, her presence is a deterrence. Her presence is a requirement, because her presence shows that these ships are escorted, the ships she's with are being protected, and so people prefer to go elsewhere where they might not be protected. Because that's so much easier to deal with. It is so much easier to deal with. But that leads us into the whole minesweeping discussion. And minesweeping is, after all, one of the key things they were built for. Now, this is interesting to me, this diagram, because it's rather useful. It shows things like, well, the kite and the otter. The kite and the otter are both these underwater sail structures, realistically, that are designed to keep the cutting wire down at the required depth and allow it to keep tension between it and across the cutting wire, so it'll let mines go free and will cut things like cable, etc., between the vessel and the floats. See the floats dangling off, preferably to one side, and you have this wire spread out. Now, the way you keep the floats off to one side is they're sort of slightly off balance in terms of the flow of the water. As you can see, the one we're seeing a picture of here, a drawing, has its rudder, well, has a fin out on one side only, and is positioned that way. And this is a simplistic methodology of dealing with mines, but it's not an ineffective methodology. It's definitely not an ineffective methodology. But realistically, you need to see how much space all this takes up on the ship's deck before we really get into discussing it. Now, what you can see here are those floats, are the kite and the otter, all the systems which are in place and are used to deploy that cutting cable. And you can also see the drums where the cable was kept. This is all part of the minesweeping system that was standard for sloops and corvettes and vessels of this. It looks like rather useful stuff, doesn't it? It also takes up quite a lot, and that's where DRAC as a scale of human measurement is really quite useful, because it does provide appropriate scale. But it's all part of the equipment they can be fitted with, and they can be just as good at launching mines as they can be at taking them out. Depth charges, whether rolled off or by thrower, all are viable systems. Again, these are vessels which are built by a generation which has experienced World War I. They've experienced the threats of submarines in World War I, where honestly mines were their greatest threat. Mines were the most potent weapon at submarines' disposal. And there was an interesting study which was done, which was basically, what if the I-400 class were built earlier, and instead of being these aviation submarines, were these huge mine layers? Where literally the Japanese could have sent them out across the world and dropped off 150, 200 mines outside various critical ports. It gets very scary for certain nations. Very, very scary for certain nations which don't have enough minesweepers by any stretch of the imagination. Surprisingly enough, one of the few nations, when you start simulating that, if they are making an attack, and rather than throwing the whole force at Australia, which is unlikely, but were throwing just a likely section of force, a couple of boats, Australia does quite well. Why? Because the RAN has the Bathurst class, because the RAN has the minesweepers and the minesweeper capacity in its force. It also has the people who are committed to the task. They understand the risks their friends in the merchant navy are going to be taking if they are running into a minefield, and so they are fully prepared to deploy these kits. Which is what it would take. With that, HMAS Warrnambool is a pretty good example to look at of what can happen when it goes wrong. Now, her career was something to talk about, and the fact that it ended the way it did, being the only Royal Australian Navy ship to ever be sunk by a mine, it's kind of sad. Because she survived World War II, and yes, they did a full investigation afterwards, and they've done all sorts of surveys, and it was no culpable negligence on the loss of the Corvette. You know, the crew, the commanding officer did their best, and 4 sailors are killed, 29 are injured because of them recovering and trying to clear mines which were laid during World War II. A war during which she played an active part. She was at Darwin when it came under its first air attack. She rescued 73 survivors in February 1942 from the Don Isorio, the Filipino merchant vessel. She was part of the transfer of troops to New Guinea. She was part of the work with HMAS Southern Cross when they carried the Netherlands East Indies troops and stores from Darwin to Dobo in the Aru Islands. She was part of the force which then goes back in September 1942 to rescue the survivors from Dobo. And in later September 1942, after doing that, she's part of the group of people which go and rescue crew of HMAS Voyager when she grounds at Badano on the southern coast of Timor. She spends most of the war doing ASW patrols and convoy protection and those missions, and then she takes part in various Japanese surrender ceremonies. She's always moving forward with the fleet. She's very much a key part of it. She does all this. In the Darwin strike, she doesn't get a single scratch. She comes under attack many times. In war, she is constantly present and constantly doing great things for a vessel her size. And then after the war, she's taking part in mine clearance work. She's doing the mine clearing duty. She's just carrying on. She's at the Great Barrier Reef, and she's just working on Cockburn Reef. 13th September 1947. Just doing her duties. It's at 4 o'clock, 1600 hours. There are different sort of discussions of it, but basically, wrong place, wrong time. They hit a mine. She's been through so many things. She had survived so much of the war. She had finished the war with not just a 4-inch gun, but a 40mm Bofors and between 2 and 3 20mm Orcons, various machine guns, and depth charges. She was a well-armed little vessel. She was a good ship. She was a good ship. She was one of the vessels launched by Mort's Dock and Engineering Company. Her battle honours are Darwin, Pacific, and New Guinea. And I presume, I say, that her sigil and arms are taken from Warrnambool's, the town's sigil and arms. Because otherwise I have no reason for thinking why she should have a rampant unicorn on her. Or a coat of arms. I really don't. But, yeah, her motto was protect and avenge, and she surely did protect, and she occasionally even avenged. Occasionally. Which brings us to life on board. What was it like for the crew? Well, I wasn't really sure how to get into describing life on board, and I decided to use a quote from this book. And you might have noticed throughout this video I've tried to use quotes from each of these books so that you get an idea of them. And hopefully, if you're interested, you'll look them up and maybe consider procuring them yourself. So this starts off on page 61 with 1944 New Year. On the 2nd of January 1944, Castlemaine escorted HMAS Bungaree from Port Moresby to position off Fitzroy Island, before proceeding to Cairns for oil and securing alongside HMAS Gympie. The crew were given recreational leave the following day, then the ship proceeded out of harbour for exercise with Warrnambool, Broome and Gympie. After completing exercises, Castlemaine, Warrnambool and Broome joined convoy TN-202 to Milne Bay. At Milne Bay, Castlemaine went alongside USS Victoria, a fuel tanker which supplied oil to most of the Australian corvettes operating in these waters. Most of January was spent on escort duties to New Guinea with sister corvettes Gladstone, Ballarat, Mildura, Lithgow and Rockhampton until orders were received on 24 January to proceed to Townsville for yet another boiler clean. During this time, the ships had to contend with cyclonic winds and seas, making life on board unpleasant and working conditions difficult. Some complete voyages had to be made by dead reckoning, as sights could not be taken in bad conditions. The first day of February 1944 found Castlemaine escorting convoy TN-213 northbound along with sister corvettes Broome, Mildura and Ballarat. The weather turned into a Force 5 gale, and 2 motor torpedo boats under tow were cast off to continue under their own power, saving the ship a dangerous additional night at sea. During February, escort duties were broken by a series of exercises and practice in Trinity Bay with the Corvettes Bundaberg, Waga, Kapunda, and Katuma, conducted by Commander D, who had embarked on the Castlemaine. Following, that's Commander, I'm presuming Commander Flotilla. D would normally stand for Destroyer, but I'm presuming they're just using the same designation because of it's the Corvettes, flotillas, and it's a flotilla group. But it's kind of interesting to think Commander, it's seeing as most of the officers in charge of the Corvettes are Lieutenant Commanders. Yes, it would be a Commander who's in charge of flotilla, not a Captain. But it could be a full Captain as well. It doesn't really tell you with rank when they give you the Commander D. And I don't think it was D flotilla, so yeah. Following this diversion, it was back to escorting duties to New Guinea without any incidents until 27th February. While in company of HMAS Rockhampton escorting convoy MV-68, the Commodore in SS Grey Lag, 30,300 tons, reported at 0400 hours they had engine trouble. Rockhampton was detached to escort the remainder of the convoy, and Castlemaine took Grey Lag in tow at 5 knots. During tow, an ASDIC contact was made at 500 yards distance. The ship's company immediately closed up to full action stations and prepared to drop the tow line. The contact was lost after 8 minutes and classified as non-sub to everyone's relief. After Grey Lag had effected temporary repairs, the tow was released at 13:15 hours, and both ships proceeded to dispersal point of Fitzroy Island. Another trip to Milne Bay followed with convoy TN-224, then a return to Townsville as an escort to SS Wichita Falls. Castlemaine moved to Cairns, securing alongside HMS Bowen at 21:51 hours on 3rd of March, prepared for boiler cleaning. At 0500 hours the following morning, report was received from NISC Cairns of possible presence of submarine in the vicinity of Grafton Passage. So with all available escorts, Castlemaine slipped at 0630 hours to conduct search, having embarked Commander D. Cairns and his staff. With Bowen and Mildura, the group swept in line abreast towards Grafton Passage and through the passage to sweep in Aryan approaches. During the morning, they were joined by the Corvettes, Broome and Townsville and Arat. So that's not 6 of them. At 08:15 hours, Commander D and his staff transferred to HMS Arat to continue search, while Castlemaine returned to Cairns to clean boilers. From the 5th to 13th of March, Castlemaine was also engaged in considerable painting and maintenance work. A party of the crew were given 48 hours leave to visit army camps at Atherton, giving them the chance to relax, take bushwalks, play sport, and eat different food. On 11th of March, a change of command took place in Castlemaine when Lieutenant Commander Basil Poole, Royal Australian Naval Reserve S, relieved Lieutenant Commander Philip Sullivan, Royal Australian Naval Reserve S, or as I've said before, RANVR. But, yeah. 3 months. She had an active time. Life on board was close. It was there wasn't a lot of space. And the ships as they were like the Flower-class Corvettes and the other small vessels of World War II. They're not exactly designed for crew comfort in mind. Add to that, zigzagging, constantly reacting to the weather, to the movements of potential ASDIC contacts around, meant that they were often a swirling mess to work around on, especially in heavy storms. Their crews could be seasick quite regularly if they weren't used to it, and when they did get used to it, they found the motion of other vessels, which was more stable, almost discomforting. But they did the job. They knew what they were doing mattered. They knew they might not see the same level of action as the destroyer crews and the other vessels which are going straight at the more fighty bouts of the war, the heart of the action. But if they didn't do it, it would be leaving the door open. It's a classic thing of, if you don't have these vessels doing this job, then frankly, there's going to be problems. If you don't have the convoys escorted, then when submarines find them, it's going to be happy hunting. If you leave open an obvious weakness, you'll be lost. So the days were long. It was a constant mission for chiefs and officers to find things to provide stimulus for their personnel, to give them activities, to keep them alert, to keep them energized, to keep them focused on the task, but also still feeling like they were engaged. You don't want crews to get into a mundane boredom, to every day to merge into one into another, for them to become stultified and staid and set in their ways, because that will mean they won't react properly when you do have a problem. You need them to be alert, you need them to be sensible, you need them to be ready for it. Luckily they were. Luckily they did a good job. And these are the other vessels, finished off. And as you can see, there's rather a lot that come from Mort's Engineering Company, Mort's Dock and Engineering Company. In fact, if you count it up, there's 15. 15. Full quarter of the force. The same as produced by the both naval dockyards combined. Yeah. There's also one produced by the New South Wales State Dockyard, but yeah, 15 by Mort's Dock and Engineering Company. 15 by a yard which is gone today. Many yards from World War II are gone today. But the point is, this was a tremendous surge of vessels. Yes, yes. You could argue that, well, the Australians produced their own equivalent, their sort of equivalent of the Flower class, yes, with the Bathurst class, but what about the Castle class and the other frigates which come afterwards? Well, they do get their own frigates. They skip their Castle class equivalent, which is not necessarily a bad thing. The River class frigates, though, well, they get operated by the Royal Navy, the Royal Australian Navy, the Royal Canadian Navy, everyone, and they really are a step up. They really are a step up on the Corvettes, because they are the capability which you haven't had before. They are using the skills you developed building the Corvettes to build something better. Something which is far closer to the sloop, the full war sloop, which was, like the Black Swan, but which is simple enough and easy enough you can produce in large numbers. But what buys the time for those ships to be built, what buys the time for that experience to be gained, and what still is useful throughout the whole war, acting as force multipliers, keeping the necessary secondary theatres running, are the Corvettes, the Bathurst class, the Flower class, all those vessels. Just because newer and better vessels come into service doesn't mean these vessels get to go out of service, get to be got rid of. No, they're still useful, they're still valuable, they're still essential tools. Now, here's the interesting thing to me about all this stuff I've been talking about in industry. Just two of the companies, two, are still going. BHP Whyalla Steelworks, they're still going. Different organisations changed a bit, but they're still going. And the Williamston Dockyard is now operated by BAE Systems Australia. And when I was looking into it, I felt, well, they were fitting out the Canberra-class LHDs. Are they involved in any of the current programmes? Not that I can really see at the moment. So they fitted out the Canberra-class LHDs. They're probably still to do with the maintenance and support of them, I would think, from what I've read. But I'm not 100% sure because, well, this is the fun when you're looking into another country's systems and another country's infrastructure and how they're using it. You might miss out the subtleties. And I do remember from my experience in Australia that I was both bemused by the similarities that you find between them and the Royal Navy and the phrases and euphemisms used, and at the same time intrigued by the subtleties of difference. But I would say that the Australians went through World War II and the 1930s building up a tremendous infrastructure capability and building up and creating a tremendous advantage for themselves. And then post-war, it seems to have disappeared over the subsequent decades. It seems to have been forgotten, moved past. The world changed. The world changed. The world moved on. That leads us to the summary, HMAS Castlemaine. Now, you might have noticed that this video has contained quite a lot about the Bathurst class, but very little about Castlemaine herself, in comparison. I've mentioned her in bits, and I'll talk a bit more about her career now, but I don't want to talk too much about her, because what I want people to do is to go visit her. She's the last representative of this wonderful class. She's got great stories on her. She's wonderfully looked after by volunteers, and she really deserves some attention. There is also a really nice fish and chip shop, literally just back this, just sort of when you look at this, looking down there, be back here, and well, if you're facing that way away from the ship, you turn left. It's literally there. You walk past it. It's beautiful. Train journey there is really not difficult. It's worthwhile visiting. It is so worthwhile visiting, and it was lovely, and the people were wonderful, and it's one of those things we look back on, and when we're talking about the Australia trip, and we always remember the day we visited her. We always talk about how nice the people were, how wonderful she was maintained, and how surprised we were at how little attention she was getting. How little attention she was getting. But yeah, she had a career. She has had a career. She's sitting in Williamstown, by the way, if you're not sure where she is. Not far from Melbourne. It's perfectly easy to go see her. And it's just worthwhile. And what I wanted to talk about in terms of her career was her commissioning. The commissioning ceremony took place on Wednesday the 17th of June 1942, a bitterly cold winter's day. Please note, having been to Australia in June, I honestly don't think Australians understand what bitterly cold means. We were walking around in June and of Australia and all these things in, as you can see, in our normal t-shirts and trousers. This is what we wear in the UK in summer. When there were Australians telling us how cold it was, we were looking at them as if they had two heads. I'm sorry. There might be parts of Australia which I go to which are bitterly cold. There might be. But having visited a fairly large chunk of the country for a month, I can honestly say at no point in June was I at all cold, let alone bitterly cold. She was placed under command of Lieutenant Commander P.J. Sullivan, a former coastal passenger shipmaster, and after war a Torres Strait pilot, so a really skilled sailor. There were 79 crew, 5 officers, 2 lieutenant commanders, 1 sub-lieutenant, 1 sub-lieutenant anti-submarine warfare, 1 sub-lieutenant gunner, and 1 lieutenant engineering. So, engineering's a lieutenant, 2 specialists, 2 lieutenant commanders, so the CEO and the executive officer. 45 executive branch, that's a petty officer coxswain, a petty officer seaman, 3 leading seamen, 30 seamen, 1 leading telegraphist, 2 telegraphists, 1 ordinary telegraphist, a leading signalman, 2 signalmen, 1 ordinary signalman, and 2 coders. See what their jobs are. 21 from the engineering room branch, chief engineering officer, so the person who really runs the engineering. 3 engineering artificers, a chief stoker, 3 stoker petty officers, and 3 leading stokers, and 10 stokers. 7 supply branch, a leading supply assistant, one supply assistant, one leading cook, one leading steward, one steward, and one cook. Ordinary. And medical branch, there's a sick berth attendant. By the end of the war, this total had been increased to 89 men because of the extra equipment added during various refits. On Monday the 22nd of June 1942, she prepared to sail for Sydney and her work-up programme before joining the fleet. The following morning, a ship departed Williamstown for Swan Island, near Queenscliff, Port Phillip, to embark 20 depth charges and then sailed for Sydney in the afternoon. On arrival in Sydney, Castlemaine underwent final completion sets with the fitting of the LL sweep and the 2 bridge Oricon guns, which had been removed in Melbourne after the gun trials. Working up exercises followed, comprising 3 days in Broken Bay to mould the inexperienced young crew into an efficient fighting team. 3 days. No, you're just about getting them to work together. Before the ship was to begin escort duties from with convoys from Sydney to Melbourne, and that shows how important it was that they're just allocating 3 days. On the night of the 12th August 1942, at a speed of 3 knots and showing dim navigation lights, Castlemaine was inbound along the eastern channel of Sydney Harbour, between the Boom Gate vessel and eastern channel green power light. Lights of another vessel were observed on the port side. At 8 minutes past midnight, Castlemaine immediately went astern, but could not avoid impacting with the Manly ferry Bellubra. Having gone on ferries in that area, I can honestly say I'm not surprised. The point of impact was about 9 feet forward of the bridge, on the port side at the after end of the mess deck. The hull was approximately 6 feet by 10 feet, with damage to the frames down to the waterline. As the ships scraped alongside, the hull of Castlemaine's port motorboat was crushed, and the port davits bent and twisted. She then proceeded down Sydney Harbour, berthed alongside HMS Naval at 0100 hours. The next morning's paper reported the incident followed. Manly ferry collision. Manly-bound ferry collided with another vessel at the harbour last night. No extensive damage was done to either vessel, and nobody was injured. And this is why I wanted to read this bit to you. And every time I read it, I just giggle. Miss Ethel Duke, Pacific Flats, Ocean Beach, Manly, said, "The ferry left circular quay at 11:45, crowded with theatre girls and others. She was due at Manly at 12:20 hours. When we were out about 15 minutes, we were thrown out of our seats by a severe impact. Everyone was excited. I was on the top deck, and the rest of the passengers rushed for a view of the happening. We could see a vessel's outlines, but could get no idea of her size. We had been hit on the starboard side. A lot of bad language was exchanged by both crews. I never heard anything like it. It was wonderful how cool all the ferry passengers kept. Many of the women dived into their handbags for cigarettes, but none showed the slightest sign of panic. The ferry continued its way, but a few minutes later we hit something else. I cannot say what it was we hit, but we received a pretty decent bump." Now, I would say the board found that no blame could be attributed to Castlemaine, although Captain of Ferry stated that the Corvette was not showing any navigation lights. Further to this, after examining the findings of the inquiry, the Naval Board found that Lieutenant Colonel Sullivan was partly to blame for the collision for not having his navigation lights burning at full brilliancy when entering the harbour. Now, that's a lovely way of getting around it. It's not at full brilliancy, so we're going to partially blame you and we're going to give up on it. But having gone on those ferries, I will say they certainly believe they are the queens of the road and do not acknowledge anyone else being anywhere near them. It was both thrilling and at the same time mildly worrying, especially as they had the same approach to each other. But no, this was a class which provided for the Australian Navy exactly what it needed. They provided the strength, they provided the capability, they provided the core of their operations. When it came to coastal convoys, when it came to running important supply runs, when it came to actually having vessels when they needed vessels. If it hadn't been for this class, they wouldn't have had much, if anything at all. And they were entirely, barring some specialist components, guns mainly, entirely Australian built. designed and built. Now, I wouldn't say conceived, because I said, my view is there is a pretty standard conception process going around the Royal Navy with sharing the testing that's been done on the slopes. Of this is what pretty much you need to be able to accommodate on a ship for it to be viable in this role, and let's go play around with it. But yeah, everything else, they are Australian. Most Australian vessels of World War II. They deserve to be remembered more. They deserve to be valued more. Now, normally at this point is when I put in a question, but I'm going to save the question for after talking about HMAS Shoalhaven. Now, Shoalhaven interested me because she's a River-class frigate, but she's actually completed to a Bay-class design because, well, a modified Bay-class design. Again, Australian modified Bay-class design to suit their facilities, their capabilities, what they can build. And she has this great service record. And one of the things I loved about going around this ship, going around Castlemaine, was finding these little nuggets in all over her. Shoalhaven, this model, this beautiful model, and going, why is it here? It's here because of the battle honours, it's here because of the connections, it's here because of the fact that the crews have value, the people involved in preserving Castlemaine value the stories of Shoalhaven as well. And she really did have a very, very cool story. Now, the story I give for Shoalhaven is from her Korean War service. She'd been assigned to British Far East Fleet Command and was operating in South Korea from the 29th of June. Her first participation in the Korean War was also the first Australian operation of the war, when on the 1st of July, under command of Commander Ian MacDonald, with a crew of 6 officers and 177 sailors, she provided escort for UN ships carrying troops and ammunition to Korean ports from Japan. She escorted the American vessel the Sergeant George D. Keithley from Toshima Island to the port of Busan, and then on 2nd July she departed to the Sasebo, carrying a South Korean liaison party. She then joined USS Kolat, a destroyer, off the coast of Korea, where she performed blockade duties during a 3-day patrol. And then she resumed her escort role for July and August, carrying out 14 convoys during her tour. She performed ASW duties and bombardment of coastal targets and was involved in action with enemy forces on several occasions, is the phrase used in most of the write-ups. And then, here's the kicker. At the outbreak of the war, when Korea kicked off, Shoalhaven had actually been due to return to Australia for a refit repair. And it was only when HMAS Warrnambool showed up on the 6th of September that she was actually able to return home, because the Australians didn't want to be out of the count. They didn't want to be not involved. They knew they needed to be present. They knew they needed to show up for their allies, so they kept to that. Even though as part of the British Far Eastern Fleet, the Australians occasionally didn't have a ship on duty, occasionally they had to go home before another one came out to replace it, it had been okay, it was fine, it was part of the Royal Navy, it was part of what they did. But with Korea going on, it was important enough they needed to be there. They needed to have this vessel there. And then, after her tour duty, she goes to Garden Island. She gets all those for a refit, and it's when the Korean Armistice Agreement is agreed in July 1953, Shoalhaven returns and takes part in the Allied patrols during 54 to monitor the peace agreement, to monitor it working. And this is why, despite her being launched in December 1944, she didn't get commissioned until May 1946, and she gets her battle honours for Korea in 1950. She's one of those ships which didn't have a World War II, built in World War II, but didn't have a World War II, because the war didn't go on long enough. The war had looked like it was still carrying on full strength, and she would have been activated. An invasion of Japan would have seen her in service. It really would have. And she would have done good work for it. So with that in mind, I get to today's question. And today's question is simple. Do you think Australia or any other country like it could do this again? Could build a small, off-the-shelf, using their own maritime industry, escort. Not a vessel for the primary theatre, not a vessel for fighting, not a fighting big battles, not a vessel which is going to be the core of any convoy group like the Type 26 Type 26R or the other vessels being procured. We're talking not even an 85 or 70% solution. We're talking a 60% solution. We're talking something which in age sail terms would be a 6th rate if it was lucky. Probably a brig or a sloop, which were unrated vessels. We're talking vessels which are the bare minimum of firepower. And I do find it interesting how that changes when you consider the frigates have 4 4-inch guns, 3 40mm guns, 4 20mm oil guns, hedgehog and depth charge throwers. They have all that. They weigh much more, displace much more than the Bathurst did. And yet, realistically, whilst the Bathursts are fine at the beginning of World War II, in 1939, they're everything you need, really, for an entry level. In 1943, 44, when you're building these are what you need. And they're 2 shafts, triple engine and triple expansion design. And I'll be talking about one of these later on in this video series. They were good for ships. But the question is, do you think we could do it again? Do you think anyone could do it again? Even America. And I'm not talking just about the physical ability to do it, I'm talking about the psychological ability to do it, to build a ship which is the bare minimum or the basic requirements for doing the job, so you can build it in numbers, to do these roles which you need done in wartime, because if you don't have something there, you're going to face trouble. And I do have a theory, and I've said this before, that any future flyer class could be uncrewed vessels. And I think you could have a mixture of maybe a crewed vessel and multiple uncrewed vessels, which are all built to sort of the similar idea for the roles. But it'd be interesting to see. The crewed vessel might carry less weapons overall, or rather less offensive weapons, so it has more space for the personnel, so they can do the maintenance and check on the other vessels. But it's a whole discussion point, that one. And I will say now, if you please do watch the end of this video, because I've got a nice little sort of video, quiet video of just us walking away for it to end on from Castlemaine. What we're coming up? Well, the year of the aircraft carrier is complete, and I think I've already mentioned what we're doing in terms of the Christmas specials, but I do have something else to share with you before we end, and that is the Western Australia Railway Museum. Now, this was what I treated myself to go and visit solo on the last day I was in Australia. Everyone else had gone home, and it was literally me on my own. I had to fly to Perth because I was returning from Perth, as I got return tickets from there, as it was worked out cheaper when I was booking it. And I wandered around Perth bookstores and was thinking, what shall I do with myself? Because I'd arrived on a really late flight, and the next connecting flight was, well, it was cheaper to stay a day and another night in a hotel than it was to get the next flight, because it was just way worked out that way. Yeah, it seemed to me certain days of the week are really bad for the flights to Australia, from Australia to the UK and back or out. There are days of the week when it's cheaper. There are days of the week when it's more expensive. When I was booking, and so I thought, well, I'll go to the naval museums. And I did. I went to naval museums in the morning. Went round them. They were fun. It was nice going around, but there wasn't really anything else I needed to see there. And I was on the train, and I just thought, well, hang on, there's a railway museum not far from here. And the great thing about Perth was the train tickets. You could get really quite cheap, easy travel. And so, I got the train to the railway museum. And I wasn't expecting much from the write-up, because the write-up really doesn't do it justice. And it's a tiny space, really. It's a postage stamp in terms of what it's containing, because it's crammed. It's the railway museum equivalent of a second-hand bookstore. You know, the tiny frontage, and you think, oh, I'm going in there, it's going to be literally, it's going to be teeny. And you go in there and go, it's got layers and layers, and there's trains here and trains here, and there's trains here. And there's all these engines, and it was wonderful. It was really, really cool, and they were really nice people, and there were so many things to do. And there are all these cool these cool engines. Some which I've never heard of before in my life, and I like railways. Admittedly, I'm more of a GWR guy than anything these days, but, you know, when I'm beyond God's wonderful railway, I've collected German engines, I've collected LNER, LMS, American trains. I'm now looking for Australian engines in N-gauge, but that's going to be something which has been put on hold until I have finished sorting out this place. I am trying to basically turning almost all videos into a living memory of, when you move house, just remember, whatever money you think you should budget for dealing with issues, quintuple it. And we thought we did a generous estimate, and we were still short. And it was past all its survey fine. But no. This museum was a highlight for me. After finishing going through it, I went, I'm not doing another museum on this trip. There is no way any other museum after this, I'll either be returning to it, in which case I've seen it and I'm just going to sit there thinking about chatting with my friends, or I'm, and what we're filming and just going to be obsessing over, did we get all the pictures? I'll just take more pictures, and that's not really a fun way to go around a museum, but it's what you do when you know you can't get back to that museum easily. And you've spent a lot of time and a lot of people's money and etc. to go and visit there to take the photos and make sure you get the video. And with a long flight back, I really didn't want that. So after going to this museum, yeah, that was my last museum on the trip. Next morning, well, I took myself down to the coast. I had a burger on the coast, not far from museums we'd gone to see in Perth, not far from the place where we'd had a nice evening chat with everyone. And just enjoyed looking out in the Indian Ocean and just thinking, when will I next be back? Will I be back? Thank you. Thank you for supporting this channel. Thank you for supporting ShipShape. Thank you for making all these things possible. Thank you for allowing us to go out and take the footage and do the things we needed to do. And I know not all the footage that I took of Castlemaine has appeared in this video, and it won't. Because longer term, I want to do a book on the whole Corvette sloop story. And pictures are going to go into that, and pictures might go into my own book on the Bathurst class at some point, putting them into the wider context of the war. It won't be like those books that I've shown you have been. It'll be about how escorts fitted into the wider war. It's something I've been toying with for a few years now. Kind of the opposite end of the escort scenario from the Tribals, Battles and Darings. The big warfighter escorts, the warfighter destroyers, the ones which are made for the toughest, meanest battles, the hardest fighting. To talk about the vessels which are made for the numbers game, where you needed to be everywhere because you couldn't afford not to be everywhere. Where it mattered more that you had a ship there than whether it was armed to the teeth, able to fight all comers, because frankly the odds are if you've got them there and you've got enough of them there, there's going to be collective action. Their submarine's going to be underwater, in which case it don't matter. Or if it's on the surface, it's going to quickly find itself in trouble with multiple assets. Thank you. Hope you enjoyed this video. Take care.